All right, the goal of this video is to explore Michael Huemer's paper, Is There a Right to Own a Gun? In this paper, he provides an important account of different kinds of rights, and then he employs the distinction between these kinds of rights in order to argue that we have the right to own a gun. So, firstly, in order to understand his arguments, we need to get a basic account of the nature of rights. So most fundamentally, rights are entitlements or freedoms possessed by individuals. So some rights are freedoms in the sense that they prohibit or prevent other people in treating us certain ways. And some rights are entitlements because they require others to provide or give us certain things. Some of these rights seem to belong to persons as such, which means they are possessed by individuals regardless of their status as members of a particular community. So even if I have no state, I have no citizenship, it seems like I nevertheless have a right to self-defense, which is to say, the right to self-defense belongs to me as such, which is to say, it's not derived from my citizenship. But other rights do seem to arise from community membership, as when citizens of particular societies gain the right to vote, which is to say, it's only as the result of my being a citizen that I gain the right to vote. And importantly, rights are binding on others. So my right to bodily sovereignty, for example, obliges you to respect it. And my right to vote obliges the government to protect it. So rights always entail certain behaviors or prohibitions that are binding on others. All right, so Huemer is going to help us clarify kinds of rights by offering different categories. And the first category has to do with the justification of the right. And when I'm talking about the justification of a right, I'm talking about what explains it or makes it appear valid to us. A fundamental right is a right which is justified and has force independent of any other rights. And I give an example here of the right to life. Claiming that the right to life is a fundamental right means that the value of a right to life is self-explanatory. We don't explain the value of a right to life by pointing to other rights we have. We don't say, for example, that we have a right to life because we have a right to free speech. It seems like we have a right to life independent of any other things that are important or matter to us. And I think we can further understand the nature of fundamental rights by seeing what derivative rights are. So a derivative right is a right which is justified and important because of other rights we possess. So for example, it seems like we have a right to self-defense. And it seems like the right to self-defense derives its value from the fundamental right to life. In other words, what explains our right to self-defense is the fact that we have a right to life. So therefore, we have a right to protect our life. Another example would be if we have health care. If we have a right to health care, then this would seem to derive its value from the right to life, because healthcare is one of the ways in which we maintain our lives. It helps keep us alive. So if we have a right to life, then we have a right to other mechanisms by which we can maintain our right to life, and that might be healthcare. In that way, the right to healthcare would derive its value from the fundamental right to life. So the second category has to do with the force or extent of the right. And what I mean by force or extent is just how binding it is. Is it binding in all instances such that we can never violate that right? Or is it only binding in some instances such that we're able to think of permissible instances of a violation of that right? Absolute rights are those rights which cannot be violated for any reasons. Now we should ask the question, are there really any absolute rights? You might think that the right to life is an absolute right because it's the most fundamental. But if we can conceive of instances where we are justified in violating the right to life of another, then we've eliminated the possibility that the right to life is absolute. So because I have a right to self-defense, if you attack me and then I kill you as the result of your attack, it seems like I was justified in so doing as a result of my right to life and as a result of my right to self-defense. So therefore, the right to life wouldn't be absolute. We can contrast absolute rights with prima facie rights. Prima facie is Latin for something like at first glance or at first blush, which just signals the idea that it's tentative. There is the right, but maybe the right can be overridden. So prima facie rights are important, but they can be violated for sufficiently important moral reasons. And the right to vote, for example, might be prima facie if we can identify reasons for suppressing it in certain instances. For example, by prohibiting the criminal from voting. This would be an example of a right that's important, but we can think of ways in which that right might be permissibly or justifiably violated. All right, so Huemer's strategy is to employ these two distinctions, that between fundamental and derivative rights, and that between absolute and prima facie rights, to explore the right to own a gun. He's going to begin by considering arguments against the right to gun ownership, and then he's going to try to combat those arguments. By combating those arguments, he's going to go some way towards establishing that, at least on his view, there's a prima facie right to own a gun, which is to say that the right to own a gun is important, but not absolute. He's going to advance this argument further by considering the value of a right to own a gun. And most importantly, he's going to establish that the right to own a gun derives its value, so is therefore derivative, from some of the most basic and important rights we possess. All right, let's take a look at his arguments. So these are arguments against gun rights that Huemer offers a reply or retort to. So the first would be that we can argue against gun rights because we can assert that we lack a right to harm others. This argument is going to hinge on the idea that other people in society have important rights, like the rights of bodily integrity and sovereignty, and guns, given their violent nature, assist in the violation of these basic rights. And we don't have a right to violate the rights of others in this way. So therefore, we wouldn't have a right to own a gun. But Huemer thinks that we don't prohibit activities or behaviors merely on the grounds that they make it easier to violate the rights of others. So, for example, classes in sword fighting hypothetically are going to enhance a person's ability to harm others. But this doesn't seem like a sufficient reason for prohibiting such classes. Or even more generally, bodybuilding would enhance a person's ability to harm others because physical strength can help us harm others. But no one is making the argument that we ought to rule out gyms on the grounds that they make it more likely or they make people more able to harm others. So Huemer's drawing on precedent here. There's many activities and behaviors that hypothetically enhance in one way or another a person's capacity to harm others, and we don't rule out those activities or behaviors. All right, next. Some argue against gun rights by asserting that we don't have a right to impose risks, even if unintended, upon others. So this argument hinges on the idea that having guns around imposes some quantity of risk. It enhances the risk of harm. It can enhance the risk of harm because it might make it more likely that one person shoots another, but it also enhances risks because it might enhance the risk of suicide, or it enhances the risk of accidents. So we don't have a right to own a gun because we don't have a right to impose risks, even if they're unintended on others. And gun possession imposes certain specific risks. Huemer does think that this is a plausible principle. In other words, we do need to think about how we are in fact imposing risks on others. But he also thinks that it proves too much, because other currently permitted activities pose greater risks than gun ownership. In other words, if we don't have a right to impose risks on others, then we need to think about those activities which already impose risks on others. And given the amount of fatalities as the result of automobile accidents per year, that would require that we outlaw driving, since after all, our driving imposes risks on others. But we don't outlaw driving, even though it imposes risks on others. And so this isn't a good argument for eliminating guns, because guns pose less risks at a statistical level than car driving. Some argue against gun rights by noting that the possession of guns amplifies conflict and increases the likelihood that they become deadly. So this argument is concerned with the possibility of violence in a moment of anger and passion. In other words, if two people get into a serious fight and all they have are their fists or their words, they might hurt each other variously, but it'll be hard for one person to kill another. But if there's a gun in the room or a person has a gun on them, then this might make it more likely that one person uses a gun and kills another. But Huemer thinks this is a false generalization. He notes that only very atypical individuals would kill as a result of an argument. And this shouldn't lead us to, let's say, violate the right of all persons just because some very slim margin of persons may be more likely to use a gun in violence as a result of conflict. So he thinks we can't generalize this way about the public. Finally, some argue there's a significant social cost to gun ownership. This is an argument of public policy. It says, look, there isn't a feasible way to identify which gun owners will use their guns in harmful ways. Therefore, the only way to avoid the social cost of gun ownership is to eliminate private gun ownership. So this argument is going to rely on the idea that it's the goal of public policy to reduce harm to the greatest extent possible. If it's the obligation of public policy leaders to reduce harm as much as possible, and if guns entail some harm, then they ought to eliminate guns because that's their responsibility. Their responsibility is to eliminate all possible harms. But for Huemer, that an activity entails some social cost is not a sufficient argument for prohibiting it. Because look, alcohol consumption has a significant social cost, but this hasn't led us to prohibit alcohol. Right? If it really was the goal of public policy to reduce harm to the greatest extent possible, then we would be ethically required as a country to prohibit alcohol use, because alcohol use does have a high social cost. But we don't think that way about alcohol. So we can't use that argument to eliminate guns. All right, with those arguments addressed, Huemer then moves on to arguments in favor of gun rights, and he has two crucial arguments in favor of gun rights. So these are arguments that he's offering in order to show why the right to own a gun is an important right. It's a valuable right. His first argument is based on the idea that gun ownership is an important lifestyle choice, and it's a recreational activity. So here the argument is that in general, we have a right to pursue the ends and activities that we want to. We have a right to try to enjoy a meaningful life in the ways that we see fit. And gun ownership provides important social, recreational, and cultural value that enhances the meaning of life of many individuals. And this counts in favor of the right to own a gun because it enhances the social value of the lives of individual persons. So that shows why there might be a right to own a gun. That at least enhances the value of gun ownership. It clarifies that the right to own a gun is important for people because people derive meaning from it. Nevertheless, I do think his second argument is the more philosophically potent argument. It's going to try to show that we have a right to own a gun because of other important rights we have. All right, so this is the argument, and I've laid it out here. Premise one of this argument says all persons have the fundamental right to life. Okay, this we've already established. We already know what it means for a right to be fundamental. A right is fundamental in the sense that it doesn't need any other of the rights we possess in order to justify it. It's self-explanatory. Premise 2, all persons have the right to self-defense, which derives its importance from the right to life. Okay, since we have the fundamental right to life, it follows that we have a right to self-defense because that's how we uphold our fundamental right to life. Okay, so premise 2 just establishes that we have a right to self-defense, and what explains the right to self-defense is its relation to the fundamental right to life. All right, premise 3, if persons have a right to self-defense, then persons have a right to adequate and effective means of self-defense. So this argument, or this premise, says that if we're going to have a right to self-defense, we're going to need to be able to do those things or possess those objects which make it more likely that we can actually act on the right to self-defense, which is to say that we're able to defend ourselves. So premise 3 establishes that if you have a right to self-defense, then you have a right to the means of self-defense. And premise 4 says, look, gun ownership is an effective and maybe adequate means of self-defense. Guns pose a significant threat. And one doesn't even need to use a gun in all instances to defend oneself. One can merely threaten to use the gun in order to defend oneself. So guns do seem to be, at least hypothetically, an effective means of self-defense. I do think we could empirically look at the data here and maybe push back on Huemer's argument. And then the final step of his argument is the conclusion, premise 5. Therefore, all persons have a right to own a gun. So this is his argument in favor of the right to own a gun. He's going to argue that the right to own a gun derives its value from the right to self-defense, and the right to self-defense derives its value from the most fundamental right to life. All right, so this entails that gun rights are derivative. They're derivative rights. His argument in favor of gun rights works to show that the right to own a gun derives its value from and is justified by the most basic and fundamental rights that there are. So since the right to self-defense is closely related to the right to life, right? And since the right to own a gun is an effective way of satisfying the right to self-defense, it follows that the right to own a gun derives its value from the right to self-defense. That's what explains it. If we didn't have a right to self-defense, it would be much less likely on this argument that we would have a right to own a gun. In other words, we'd have to significantly emphasize other values that the right to own a gun protects, like the recreational value. So it follows that on this argument, a prohibition on gun ownership would be almost tantamount or equivalent to a violation of the right to self-defense, because it would take away one of the most effective means of self-defense, says Huemer. Okay. Using our other distinction, we should see that Huemer thinks that gun rights are prima facie. So his argument in favor of gun rights establishes the prima facie right of all persons to own a gun, which is to say, all persons in good standing have this right. But even though he thinks that he's established the importance of gun ownership as a right, he doesn't think the right is absolute. That is to say, he doesn't think it's never permissible to violate the right to own a gun. A prima facie right is one that is important, but may be overridden for sufficiently important moral reasons. And hypothetically, knowledge that a person poses a significant danger or maybe has a history of violence would provide us sufficiently important moral reasons to violate that person's right to own a gun. But only that person. For all other persons, the right is maintained. So it's prima facie in the sense that although it applies to most people, in certain instances we might want to eliminate that right given their nature or given their criminal history, for example. All right, so just a review. Huemer employs important distinctions about rights. So this is between fundamental and derivative and absolute and prima facie, and uses them to explore the permissibility of the right to own a gun. He spends significant time answering arguments against the right to own a gun. And once he's answered these, he tries to establish that the right to own a gun is an important one. It's important because of its recreational value and also because it's derivative. It derives its value from the most fundamental rights that there are. He doesn't think ultimately that the right to own a gun is absolute because there may be important reasons to violate a particular person's right to own a gun. So it's not an absolute, it's merely prima facie.